Please turn in your Bibles today to the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 24, and place a marker in both 2 Samuel, chapter 11, and 1 Chronicles, chapter 21. Now, those scriptures passages should be on the screen for you. I'm not going to say them again, but today when I read from the Word, I'm going to be reading from the New International Version as we pick up our series that we've been in for a few weeks called The Heart of a Leader. In this series, we're looking at several attributes that are extremely important for a leader to have in their life. And to do that, we're looking at the lives of several of the Bible's most influential and impactful leaders. So far, we have talked about leading with wisdom, leading with courage, and leading with patience. And today, we're going to turn to one of the Bible's most influential leaders. Then in the Old Testament, today we're going to talk about King David. And David is a good person to look at when you're talking about leadership. David was Israel's second king, but he was their first good king, wasn't he? You know, Saul wasn't much of a king. God chose David to be Israel's king when King Saul began to disobey the Lord's commands. In fact, the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 13 that Samuel told Saul that if Saul had only followed the Lord's instructions, that the Lord would have established Saul's kingdom over Israel for all time. But because he hadn't, the Lord had sought out a man after his own heart and had appointed him ruler of the people. That man is David. David is the only man in the Bible that is referred to as a man after God's own heart. And he's one of the few men in the Bible that God bragged on. David was a strong leader, and he had many good leadership characteristics. But today, we're going to look at a few stories from David's life, and we are going to zoom in on just one attribute of David's heart, just one attribute of his leadership. Today, we're going to talk about integrity. Everybody say integrity. The dictionary defines integrity as the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. It also refers to integrity as moral uprightness. Integrity is doing the right thing even if no one else knows it. A great example of this is the PGA golfer Ray Floyd, who in June of 1986 was one stroke behind the leader of the Hanover Westchester Classic, which had a prize for first place of around $108,000. In 1986, who knows, that was a lot of money. It's quite a bit of money today, but back then it was a whole lot of money. Well, Ray Floyd was one stroke behind the leader chasing that $108,000, and he lined up to take a short 9-inch putt. And as he lined up, wouldn't you know it, the ball moved just a little bit. In fact, the movement was so small that no one else noticed it. You guys have probably had this happen to you playing putt-putt, haven't you? You step up and you go and you get lined up and maybe your club touches it just a little bit and it just moves, barely, not even an entire revolution. Well, nobody else saw what had happened, but immediately Ray Floyd assessed a penalty stroke against himself. Later, someone asked him about that, and they were shocked that he had done that. And they asked him, did anyone else even see it move? And this is what Ray said: I don't know if they did or didn't, but that's irrelevant. Church, that's integrity right there. He went on to say that in golf, there's not a referee following you around. So if you don't follow the rules, you're not even really playing golf. That can be applied to life as well. That's what integrity looks like. And integrity is extremely important. In fact, in a recent study of 100 of the nation's top 1,000 companies. They interviewed these executives and they asked them what the most undesirable qualities in an employee is. And do you know what number one was? Dishonesty. They went on to say that if a company believes that an employee lacks integrity, all positive qualities, ranging from skill and experience to productivity and intelligence, become meaningless. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. As a leader, integrity is even more crucial because it serves as the foundation for everything we do. Today we're going to look at a few stories from the life of David, a man after God's own heart, and we're going to examine what it looks like to lead with integrity. The first story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 24. Now, by the time we get to this story, David has already been anointed by the prophet Samuel as king of Israel, but he hasn't been given the job yet. Saul is still leading the nation of Israel as king. And as it turns out, Saul is not a very big fan of David's. You see, after David killed Goliath in the famous story that we've all heard, Saul ends up putting David over a regiment of soldiers. And as they go to battle, David's regiment is always much more successful than anyone else. In fact, after one battle, they were coming home from the battle, and as they entered the city, the people began to sing a song. Does anyone know what the song was? I don't know what the music was, so I can't sing it for you, but I'll tell you the words. It said, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. How many people know that that wasn't a very popular song with King Saul? Saul decided that he hated David, and he even tried to have him killed. But David snuck away in the middle of the night, and eventually Saul learned about what area David was hiding in, and he took 3,000 soldiers with him to hunt David down. And that's where I want us to pick up the story in verse number 3 of 1 Samuel 24. It says, he came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or to lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Today we're going to look at 3 ways that integrity is exhibited in the life of a leader. And the first is that integrity does what is right. All through David's life, we find him doing what is right. When he stands at a crossroads, more often than not, David makes the right decision. He chooses to live with morals and in an upright way. We actually see this long before this story. For example, after David was anointed king, when his brothers went off to battle, where did we find David? His father decided he wanted to send some food to the valley of Elah where they were facing off against the giant Goliath. So he called David up, and where was he? He was watching the sheep. The kid had already been crowned king of Israel, and he went back to take care of the sheep. He went back to do what he was supposed to do. And then when his father called him and told him to take the food, in 1 Samuel 17:20, it says, early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. Again, David didn't just run off and leave the sheep on their own. He ensured that they were taken care of because they were his responsibility. And it's a good thing that he did, because after David killed Goliath, it says that Saul wouldn't let him go back home. So if he had left the sheep alone, they would have all been scattered and eaten. David was a young man of integrity, and that means doing what is right. Now, in the passage that we read, Saul has been ruthlessly hunting David down, and David is hiding in the back of a cave with his men. And about that time, Saul needs to use the little king's room. So he slips into the cave, and he sees, or he doesn't see anything. Sorry. Well, he sees something. We're not going to talk about what he sees. He slips into the cave, and David sees King Saul without any defense. They're waiting for whatever David wanted to do with them. The men said, this is what the Lord was talking about when he said that I'm going to deliver your enemy into your hands to do with as you wish. Church, can you imagine what a gift this was to David? All David had to do was kill King Saul, and everything would change. He would no longer be being chased by a madman. He would be able to return home to his wife, whom I'm sure that he missed. And he could go ahead and be crowned king, a job that God had already chosen for him. And it certainly seems like that David would have been at least somewhat justified if he had done so. But David was a man of integrity. He chose to do what was morally right rather than doing what would make it easier on him. Church, how many times have you found yourself in a position where if you did something, if you made a certain decision, that it would change everything for you? And it was a decision that you could probably even justify. And it could fix all of your problems, and all you had to do was ignore that annoying little voice in the back of your head that was telling you not to do it. Am I the only one that's found myself in that situation about 3 million times? Integrity does what is right. I also want to take a moment to point something out here. Something that we might miss if we're not careful. You see, in David's case, it seems that doing the wrong thing also happened to be the popular decision. All of the soldiers with David were telling him, do it. Do it. This is your chance. Do it. See, they all want to go home to their wives too. Do it. It amazes me that in David's band of brothers, there wasn't one guy who stood up and said, David, I don't think you should kill the king. See, the first thing this brings to light is that as a leader, you should surround yourself with other people of integrity. Surround yourself with people who do the right thing so that when you go to them for counsel, they encourage you to do the right thing. Can't tell you how many times I've been frustrated with Christina for telling me to do the right thing. I'm thankful for it, but I don't like it in the moment. The other thing that comes to light here is that just because a decision has the support of the people does not mean it's the right thing to do. I feel like that knowing that fact is becoming increasingly important with each passing year. Let me tell you something. Just because the government allows it or the masses support it doesn't mean that it's right. Doesn't mean that you should do it. Some things are wrong even if no one else says that they are. Integrity does what is right. Well, eventually Saul died and David was anointed, he'd already been anointed. David was crowned king of Israel. And later, David did something that we have to read about if we're going to fully understand integrity. This thing happened in 2 Samuel chapter 11. I want us to look there together. We're going to start in verse 1. It says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed, and he walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Wow. What a story from the life of the man after God's own heart. Pastor, are you sure you want to include this story when you're talking about integrity? I mean, best case scenario, he just committed adultery with this woman. And worst case, he used his authority to rape her. You sure you want to read this story? Well, buckle up, church, because that's not all he did. See, if we continued reading, we'd see that Bathsheba got pregnant from this little encounter. So David had to come up with a plan to cover up his sin, to cover up his actions. So he brought her husband, Uriah, back from the battlefield with hopes that they would spend the night together. And then everyone would just assume that when the child came, that it was Uriah's child. Everything would be okay. But Uriah was a man of integrity. He refused to go home and to be with his wife when his brothers in arms were still out sleeping in the field. By the way, that's also where David should have been. Instead, Uriah slept at the gates of the palace with the king's guard. So the next night, when David found out about this, he said, "Man, that didn't work. I know what I'll do. I'll get Uriah drunk." So he got him drunk with the hopes that then he would go home to his wife. But yet again, he refused to do so. And he slept at the palace entrance with the king's guard. Well, if David couldn't get Uriah to sleep with his wife, he had to make it okay for him to sleep with her. And then just hope that nobody did the math when the baby came. So David came up with a plan that ensured Uriah would be killed in battle. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield, and Uriah was killed. And after the time for Bathsheba's mourning was complete, David had her brought to the palace, and he married her. Integrity does what is right. Right? Well, does anyone remember from last week's message the second person that a leader needs to be patient with? Yeah. A leader needs to be patient with himself when he messes up. See, let me remind you something, church. We're all humans. And there's only one human who's ever lived who didn't make a mistake. And that was Jesus, and that was because he was all human, but he was also all God. Every one of us makes mistakes. We all mess up. And all too often it's the result of temptation causing us to sin. See, that's what happened with David here. David was somewhere he never should have been. And he ended up seeing something that he never should have seen. And the enemy used that to tempt David and to cause him to fall into sin. David messed up. Integrity does what is right, but sometimes we mess up. And when that happens, the second thing integrity does is integrity admits when it's wrong. David had messed up, and he had messed up big. So God sent the prophet Nathan to talk to David and confront him about this. So David was talking to David, and he told him a story. Nathan told him this story about a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man had all the cattle and all the sheep that he could ever want, but the poor man just had one little lamb that he loved like one of his own children. Well, someone came to visit the rich man, and he had to make him a meal. But the rich man, instead of taking one of his own sheep, he took the sheep from the poor man. He had it slaughtered, and he prepared a meal for his visitor. David heard this story, and he was enraged. He said this man needed to pay back 4 times what he had taken, and he needed to die for what he had done. It was at that moment that Nathan told David, "You're the rich man." He said, "You had all the wives, all the women you wanted. You could have had anyone else, but you took what Uriah had and claimed it as your own." This caused David to realize what he had done. And in verse 13, David told Nathan, "I've sinned against the Lord." David admitted that he was wrong. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't justify. He just said, "You're right. I've sinned against the Lord. I was wrong." Church, being able to admit when they've done wrong is one of the greatest signs of a strong leader. It's not an easy thing to do, and too many leaders just cannot seem to do it. Not long ago, I saw the White House press briefing. I usually watch these almost every day. I was watching the White House press briefing, and they were going over an after-action report concerning the United States' exit from Afghanistan. You all saw on the news what a mess that ended up being, right? Well, they did this after-action study to go in and determine what they could learn about the process and what could have been done differently. And they were reading this after-action report on the press briefing, and I was watching and I was listening, and they had an entire laundry list full of things that other people did wrong, that other people should have done differently. But this report took zero personal responsibility for anything that our administration might have done wrong. Some leaders cannot admit when they are wrong. They will shift blame. They will downplay their actions or their involvement. They will deflect responsibility at every turn. But not a good leader. Not a leader with integrity. Integrity does what is right. Integrity admits when it's wrong. And then finally, integrity accepts responsibility. Pastor, isn't that the same thing? Isn't admitting that you're wrong the same thing as accepting responsibility? Well, they're close, but no, they're not the same thing. You see, it's one thing to admit that you're wrong. It's an entirely other thing to be willing to face the music. Some leaders will admit that they're wrong, and then they'll skip town. They'll admit that they're wrong on their way out. They'll admit that they're wrong when there's no price to pay, when it's not going to affect them negatively in any way. But real integrity takes responsibility even when there's a cost, even when it's going to affect you, even when it's going to hurt. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 has a story that we don't have time to read today, at least not the whole thing. But in this story, the Bible tells us that Satan rose up and caused David to take a census. He caused David to give a command that a census be taken in Israel. You say, what's so wrong with that? Well, it was an act of pride. It was David saying, look how great I am. Look what I've done. So he told Joab, one of his generals, to take a census. And Joab tried to convince David not to do it. He said, King David, please don't do this evil thing. David didn't listen. Well, eventually David realized what he had done and that it was wrong, but it was too late. He asked God to forgive him, but God was angry. And he told David to choose one of three punishments for the nation of Israel. He could either choose 3 years of famine, 3 months of being attacked by Israel's enemies, in which many people would lose their lives, or 3 days of punishment from the sword of God, with the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. I got to tell you, church, if I was given that decision, I'm glad I haven't been. Hope I don't ever am. If I were, I probably would choose the 3 months of attacks by your enemies. Because at that point, at least you got a fighting chance. Famine, that's going to last 3 years. That's way too long to go through a situation. And we all know you can't fight against the Lord. But David didn't think like me. David chose 3 days of punishment from the Lord. He said, please don't let me fall into the hands of our enemies. Let us fall into the hands of our merciful God. He chose 3 days of punishment from the Lord, and immediately 70,000 Israelite men fell dead. Then God sent an angel to destroy Jerusalem. But as the angel started to do so, God was saddened, and he told the angel, stop. He told him to withdraw his hand. That's what the Bible says. And at that moment, David looked up and saw the angel standing between heaven and earth with his sword drawn toward Jerusalem. Church, how many people know that that would be an imposing sight? David fell to his face, and verse 17 tells us that he prayed, and this is what it says. David said to God, was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I, the shepherd, have sinned and done wrong. These are but my sheep. What have they done? He said, Lord my God, let your hand fall on me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people. David said, if you're going to punish someone, punish me. I'm the one who messed up. Integrity accepts responsibility. A person with integrity is willing to pay for his or her mistakes. Today we're talking about the heart of a leader. The heart of a leader has integrity. And a person with integrity does what is right, admits when they're wrong, and is willing to accept responsibility. I'm going to ask everyone in the room to bow your head and close your eyes. Before we go any further, I want to make sure I know who I'm talking to, so raise your hand if you're a leader. In case you've forgotten, that's everyone. You can put your hands down. Today, if you're here and you're a leader and you say, Pastor, I need God to help me live with integrity. I need God to help me lead with integrity. There are situations in my life where I choose to take the easy road, to do what's popular instead of what's right. I need God to help me to be able to admit when I'm wrong. I try to do right, but sometimes I make mistakes. But when that happens, Pastor, I catch myself lying instead of just admitting when I'm wrong. And I don't like to lie. I'm not a liar. I don't want to do that. But I do it. Or, Pastor, I need God to help me be willing to take responsibility for my actions. Perhaps you're in a situation right now where you've made a mistake. You've been hiding that mistake because you're scared of the repercussions. Say, I need God to help me to stand up, admit that I've done wrong, and accept responsibility. If either of those three things applies to you, you say, Pastor, I need God to help me live and lead with integrity. I want you to lift your hand right where you're at. Who else? Thank you. You can put your hands down. Lord, thank you for the example of King David. God, I want to live in such a way where you can say about me that I'm a man after your own heart. I want to live with integrity. And I know that that doesn't mean that I'm always going to make the right decisions. It doesn't mean that I'm never going to sin. But when I do, I pray that you'll let me be strong enough and honest enough to admit my mistakes, to accept the responsibility for my actions. And Lord, I pray that same thing for each one who lifted their hands today. Each one that said, I need God to help me lead with integrity. Lord, I pray that you'll let this word get deep down in our hearts, that you'll begin to change us from the inside out, that people, as they interact with us on a daily basis at school or at work or in our homes, God, that they will see that we are truly people of integrity, and that it will have a positive influence on those around us. I praise you and thank you. In Jesus' name.